Welcome and thank you for joining us at the New York State Writers Institute. I'm John Warren. This is a special series of presentations on the theme Rebuilding the Republic. These authors and their books explore the political and social forces that are demanding a serious re-examination of this nation's core democratic principles, including the threat of political insurrection, racist violence, and economic inequity. Before I introduce today's guests, Dr. Kristen Ghodsee and Bhaskar Sunkara, I'd like to remind you that you can see all of our author videos by subscribing to our YouTube page. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and at nyswritersinstitute.org, where you can learn more about the Writers Institute and can also make a contribution to support future programming like this. Now I'd like to introduce our guests. Dr. Kristen Ghodsee is an ethnographer and professor of Russian and East European studies at the University of Pennsylvania, mostly known for her work in post-communist Eastern Europe and in particular post-socialist gender studies. Her many books are substantial and scholarly. Her most recent is Second World, Second Sex, Socialist Women's Activism and Global Solidarity During the Cold War. But the book we're going to talk about today, the last book, was a bit of a departure from academia. It's engaging, biting, sometimes funny, sometimes disturbing, always informative. It's hard to put down. And it's Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism and Other Arguments for Economic Independence. Written for a popular audience, this book distills more than 20 years of study of the Eastern Bloc with a focus on how people, especially women, fared before and after the fall of the Berlin Wall. If you're not familiar with the work of Dr. Ghodsee, get this one first. There's a link to purchase it from a local bookstore below. Welcome and thank you for joining us, Dr. Ghodsee.
Thank you so much for having me.
Bhaskar Sunkara is a political writer, editor, and publisher. He was studying history at George Washington University when he came up with the idea for Jacobin, which is read by an estimated everyone on the left in the United States. In 2018, Jacobin purchased Tribune, the London-based democratic socialist journal founded as a newspaper in the 1930s and a cornerstone of labor politics there. Last year, Sunkara was named to Fortune magazine's 40 Under 40. I'm guessing that's the first time the editor of a radical left journal has been so honored, and perhaps an acknowledgement that not only are there actual leftists in the United States, but their numbers are growing. Sunkara's book, The Socialist Manifesto, The Case for Radical Politics in an Era of Extreme Inequality, is an approachable primer on socialist history in the United States and how it should inform the future. It's also biting, witty, and really funny. It goes beyond class struggle to consider what democratic socialism offers in the fights against racism and sexism. If you're interested in socialism, you've got to add this to your list. Thank you, Bhaskar, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Let me first say that both of these books are really entertaining, right? And you've both laid to rest the image of the stodgy, monochrome communist bureaucrat lecturing the masses on economic planning. But what were you thinking about with the popular approach to these books?
Should I start with them? I mean, for me, I think that obviously I don't have the same academic background, so it wasn't so much distilling works of scholarship, but it was distilling a lot of experience and history that I picked up over the years on the U.S. left. At the time I started writing the book, I was 28 years old, but I had joined DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, when I was 17. So I had these 11 years, and all of a sudden I went from being among the younger, or maybe youngest person in a very old movement filled with lots of people over the age of 60, to being one of the veteran members of the movement as DSA went from an organization of around 5,000 people to, I guess now it's an organization of 92,000 people. So I felt like there needed to be a accessible place that captured a lot of the an illustrated history of the socialist movement in terms of finding key and important moments and lessons. So it aims to do a few things. One of the things I'm proud of in the book is trying to synthesize the history of social democracy back into the history of socialism. So we need, in other words, a left and young leftists who aren't just interested in the most dramatic events of the Russian Revolution, but actually think about what social democracy managed to accomplish in a whole host of things and why it was eroded. I think in the same way that we can look soberly now at state socialism and what it managed to accomplish, both deliberately and almost by accident. I think there's a lot of parallels to be told about the way in which new societies were created through the social democratic experiments of the 20th century as well.
Yeah, for me, I mean, I'm probably on the older end of the spectrum. I came into my politics in the Reagan era in the 80s, where it was really not at all acceptable, really, to call oneself a socialist, because these were the evil empire people. But I have been teaching a class called Sex and Socialism since 2002, when I first started teaching at the university level. And at that time, I was also the faculty advisor to the YDSA club on my campus. And so I was working with students, and I've been largely based in the academy, largely as a scholar, working primarily on women's rights before and after the end of communism in Eastern Europe. And what happened in my case was that I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times in August of 2017 that kind of exploded in my face. I was uniquely and rather naively unprepared for the reaction that it was going to get in the United States, because I was just basically synthesizing research that I've been writing for a long time. And anyway, I was approached by a New York publisher who basically asked me if I was willing to expand the op-ed into a popular book. And I was very reticent to do so, because I'm not a popular writer. That's a skill that I have not really cultivated. I tend to be one of these long-winded academics who spends a lot of time in the archives or speaking to people doing ethnographic research or oral history research. So it was a very different medium for me. But I realized that a lot of my students who have been excited about socialism in one form or another for a really long time don't necessarily, as Bhaskar said, don't really have access to accessible texts that make it easy for them to understand what the movement is about, what the history is, and all the different permutations of that history. And so, I made a deal with the publisher, which was they wanted that title. So I had to go let them have the title. But my end of the bargain in that was that I would have unlimited endnotes. And so I could actually link to as many studies, actual scholarly studies, as possible if people were interested in that. And that was how I ended up writing this much more popular book, which is really kind of an outlier in my other, scholarly writing.
My publisher named my book too. Initially, I had Socialism in Our Time, which I felt was very artful, but I see the marketing wisdom of the Socialist Manifesto instead of that.
Similarly, I mean, why women had better sex under socialism. I mean, wow, could you have a more clickbaity title than that? I'm not really sure, right? but they the original op-ed in the New York Times was called that or something like that, and so they wanted it, which New York Times picked. So they wanted to pick up obviously on that.
And that, by the way, that op-ed and the book's release, but the op-ed especially was that disseminated so far beyond the boundaries of the existing left, and I think it in part also resonated in Europe and other places where people who are obviously anti-authoritarians, as we all are, and obviously very critical of a lot of aspects of these systems, also wanted to discuss why certain aspects of life just seem better. And the truth is, because the world is complex and systems are complex, and certain aspects of life, were better.
And of course, the book has 6 chapters. Only 2 of them are really about sex, right?
That's right. Yeah. It's just, I mean, they wanted the title, they wanted it to be there. And so, yeah, the book deals with many more aspects of particularly women's lives, right? So leadership and motherhood and work and citizenship and things like that. But there are 2 chapters that are very specifically about these, studies that have to do with comparative levels of satisfaction or whatever. And that's the part that people, obviously want to talk about because it's interesting. But I also think, again, I'm a social scientist, and when we think about comparing people's ordinary lives or the experience of the economic system, you need to do tests. It's not just theory. We could actually talk about empirical differences in the way that people perceive their personal relationships, their interactions with other people. And so Eastern Europe really gives us a perfect natural experiment, because these are people who grew up under one economic system where the state primarily owned the means of production on behalf of the citizens. And then suddenly they had this crazy, wild neoliberal form of capitalism. You know, during the 90s, it was the wild, wild East. And you could really see the impacts on people's lives and how those impacts were disproportionately distributed based on rural urban divides, based on education divides, but very interestingly, also based on gender. And so for me, the story of the book is again, it's this synthesis of research that I've been doing for a really long time, which is to show that not everything about state socialism in Eastern Europe was as bad as most Americans want us to think it is. But secondly, that in some aspects, particularly in the field of women's rights, but I can name other fields as well, the socialist states actually really did do what they promised to do. And they had a particular way of imagining public provision of services that really did provide concrete benefits for workers and women in a way that we see 30 years later, many people in Eastern Europe still don't have the standards of living that they had prior to 89 or 91, if you're talking about the former Soviet Union. And that is something that Americans do not realize. They do not understand that the 90s in Eastern Europe was a longer and deeper depression than the Great Depression in the United States, and that many people suffered and are still suffering to this day.
Yeah, I hope we can talk more about that. But before we get too far, I think we should, one of the things about both of your books is that it really helps, I think, readers understand that capitalism isn't just about markets, it isn't about products, but it's about the way markets are organized and how products are, the conditions under which products are delivered. And many Americans, I think, really don't understand socialism at all. And I'm sure you experience this as well. But so maybe we could just start with what socialism really means to each of you. What are we talking about when we're talking about socialism?
Well, I think one way to start the conversation is actually, if you want to start with a liberal philosopher, think about the famous John Rawls' veil of ignorance, and think about what a good society is. And I think at the very least, a good society is a society in which we allow people, regardless of accidents of birth, to reach their potentials. And then what does it mean to reach their potential? Well, it means having access to nutrition, to healthcare, to housing, having these guarantees. And sometimes you can give these guarantees by direct state provision. In other cases, maybe you just provide a safety net and so on. But I think any American takes for granted the fact that if you're born in like Fairfield County, Connecticut, you're going to have a radically different life experience, most likely, than if we were born in Waterbury or some other city. I mean, we just take that for granted, but it's not the case everywhere to that extreme, and it doesn't have to be that way. So I think that at the very minimum is what socialism is. And I think a lot of those core objectives of socialism were actually achieved in social democracies that just managed to inject doses of socialism within capitalism. I do think there are some other deeper questions that socialists ask, questions about the equal distribution of power and questions about democracy. So in other words, if we think that democracy is a good thing at the ballot box once every 4 years, what would democracy look like if we brought that logic to the shop floor? Why do we allow our workplaces to be run as dictatorships? So obviously the experiments in democracy to constitute unions or worker councils is one, but maybe we could apply this logic further and say that workplaces should be owned by the people who work there, and they should be able to elect and recall their management. And if we're worried about incentives or destabilization, well, having a share of profit instead of just a fixed wage might encourage people to work a bit harder anyway, or at the very least, not to work not to get fired, which I think is the way most people have to work today. So I think socialists are meant to ask these questions, but the beginning is a core egalitarian sentiment. The idea that we want a society in which everybody can reach their potential, and we don't believe in having masters over us or masters or inferiors below us. That we believe fundamentally that we all have different talents and abilities, but we don't need to exert these talents and abilities in a zero-sum way, in which we only make gains by domination over others. And the last thing I should say, the caveat is, obviously, wealth creation is not a zero-sum game in capitalism or other systems, but autonomy and power often is. So, in other words, if you run a capitalist workplace, it is true that you can make profits and your workers can also improve their standards of living. And that's the reason why the world has been getting better and much more abundant over time. But when it comes to rights and say over how the workplace is structured, and when it comes to autonomy and those questions, those are zero-sum questions. And the socialist argument is that labor can take on the tasks of capital and the productive work that capital does do, but capital needs our labor to keep on going.
Yeah, so for me, I mean, I would even push the philosophical definitions of socialism back further. I do a lot of work on, for instance, the utopian socialist in Europe, but particularly I'm interested in people like John Stuart Mill, who's obviously, you know, a kind of a hero of a lot of right-wing people because of his views on liberty. But in his posthumously published biography, he called himself a socialist. And he really thought of socialism as the opposite of individualism. And he thought of socialism as a morally superior stance, that people would actually be happy if they lived in a cooperative society. And so Mill doesn't actually reject the idea that there are some economic natural laws that create wealth. But he says that what we do with the wealth once we've created it is absolutely up to us. We can distribute it how we want. And I think that, like, if you go back to another interesting philosopher, Karl Polanyi, who talks, he wrote this really important book called The Great Transformation, which was about how the market came to dominate society and how that process was actually kind of laid out in the early part of the late 19th century, early 20th century. But he has a wonderful article from, I think, 1933 called The Essence of Fascism, where he really talks about how freedom and democracy has its natural end in socialism. Because as Bhaskar said, if you believe in democracy, if you believe that people should have rights over their political lives, which, by the way, during the Cold War is what we fought for as a country when we were opposed to places like the Soviet Union. We were for people's self-determination politically. That obviously extends economically as well. You cannot be free at the ballot box if you are a slave at your job. If you cannot leave your job because you do not have health insurance, or you cannot leave your job because there's some non-compete clause that has been forced upon you, if you cannot leave your job for whatever reason, you are not free. And I think that the one thing that socialism, you know, it gets a bad name because of the experiences of 20th century state socialism as being something that limits freedom and personal liberty. And in fact, I think one of the most important things that Bhaskar's book does, and other people who are writing about this now try to impart, is that socialism means more freedom for more people, not less freedom. It means more control over your life. It means more control over your workplace. It means more control over the decisions that you get to make about your future. And it means more freedom for your children and more control for your children's future. So as long as we get stuck with the baggage of the word socialism because of the experiences of the 20th century. But I think one of the most important things for me as somebody who has, spent a lot of time thinking about this is that especially for women, we have more choices in society if there are wider social safety nets that do not devolve all care work into the private sphere, where women are basically expected or socialized to do it for free. So there are concrete things that I could talk about, but I think that the broader understanding here is that the technologies of socialism are going to be different depending on the movements, but some kind of worker ownership of the productive parts of society, or collective ownership of the productive parts of society. And so that could mean, like, for all of the workers who are going to be put out of jobs by driverless cars, for instance, why not take the technology of driverless cars and have whatever profits are being generated by that technology transferred to these people? Like, the people own the driverless cars, and those driverless cars create wealth, that goes to the workers, not to the one or two corporations or CEOs or whatever who own the driverless cars. Like, it's about thinking about the structure of ownership. And, this is a big, long debate, so I'm not going to get into the nitty gritty of it. I think Bhaskar does a great job in his book of going through all of these different iterations in the European context. But I think it's really important to understand that it's not just about taxation and redistribution. It's also about workers having a fair share of the wealth that they generate in society.
Yeah, I think that's a really great and important point that gets lost, that, socialism is pushing democracy forward. It's not retreating from democracy. It's pushing it forward. Maybe, one of the knee-jerk responses to socialism is that I always hear it's been proven that it doesn't work. And I know, Dr. Ghodsee, you spent a lot of time working in Eastern European state socialism. Could you talk a little bit about how that affected the status of women? And you said it was you called it a natural experiment. Maybe you could give us a little bit on that as well.
Sure. So first of all, call me Kristen. and second of all, I literally, this is something I could talk about until the cows come home. So I'm going to try to be really brief. But the key thing here is that going back to the very, very early days of utopian socialist theory in Eastern Europe, and all the way through people like Bebel and Clara Zetkin and Alexandra Kollontai, and to the state socialist Kollontai was in the Soviet Union after 1917, and the state socialist regimes in Eastern Europe after the Second World War. They all had commitments to the socialization of what we would think of as domestic work. And they were also committed to improving women's education and training and their incorporation into the labor force. So all of that over a long period of time allowed for women to better combine what we think of as their, what we talk about these days as work-family balance. And rather than the kind of lean-in sort of Sheryl Sandberg feminism where you just work harder, and you too can get to the C-suite. This was an idea that the family and the work that women do is something that is valuable to society, and so society should invest resources or share resources in order to socialize this labor to the greatest extent possible. That gave women so much freedom in their personal lives, to know that their children wouldn't go hungry, to know that they would have a roof over their heads, to know that they would have access to healthcare, to know that they would have access to universities and other kinds of education, kindergartens for their kids, access to subsidized food, not the greatest variety. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Nobody had really fashionable clothes or anything like that. There were lots of critiques that I could talk about the system. But if you have a basic social safety net, a floor under which both men and women cannot fall, it creates a sort of stability in society that is not only emancipatory for women, but it also takes all of the pressure off of romantic relationships so that they're no longer economic transactions. And that, in the end, is good for everybody, men and women alike.
That's great. So, Bhaskar, how do you address the reduction? I mean, you're editor, publisher. How do you, in your work, address the reductionist opposition to socialism that focuses on the failures of state socialisms and ignores the successes or even the possibility of moving forward, after having learned lessons? How do you approach that in your work?
Yeah, I mean, so I do think that the record of a lot of self-described socialist movements were records of failure, and to understand why, we have to also consider just the context in which they emerged. So often these were revolutions in the most underdeveloped countries in the most adverse conditions, and it would be extremely difficult for them to succeed. And this applies to not just the Eastern Bloc, but also this applies to expanding experiments in Africa, in Tanzania and elsewhere, where it was far more popular and far more democratic, and also had a lot of setbacks and failures. So on the one hand, if you are serious about socialism, you should be concerned, or you should look at, okay, what was failures born out of contingent facts, failures born out of things that are correctable, like, for example, a lack of a belief in a free civil society, or a lack of those traditional liberal concerns, which I think a lot of the left today in the global north, or the left all around the world, I think has accommodated itself, and I mean that in the best way possible, to a lot of small L, like liberal concerns, at least as it relates to maintaining a free society and multi-party democracies and so on. But if you can separate, and I know this will be warped and taken out of context by someone at some point, but if you can separate out the sheer terror and authoritarianism and whatever else of the Soviet experiment, and you think about it along the terms of the way a lot of its protagonists thought about it, which is essentially as like a proto-developmental state, then really the levels of growth and development, only Japan compares favorably to it. Japan, emerged from just total backwardness to the pinnacle of a wealthy power over the course of the 20th century. But the Soviet Union's, if you think of the Soviet Union as an attempt to aggressively develop a backward country into a power, then it succeeded on its own terms. Now, for us, we think of something very different when we talk about socialism. We think of socialism as a way to give workers not only voice at their own workplace, but also exit options, the ability, let's say, including, for women to leave abusive relationships because they're no longer, even in a small reform, let's say, that we could get in the US, they wouldn't be tied to, women wouldn't be tied to their husband's employer-sponsored health insurance. They would have a state guarantee of health insurance. And even that little thing obviously has profound, feminist implications, for instance. So voice and exit is the way I would define socialism. And I would say that we know the history of the socialist movement in the US, which has been rooted in the fight for greater and greater democracy, the fight for a free civil society against authoritarianism, and so on. But I do think we should look at its failures, and also its successes too, because the successes, I think, of creating welfare states in Europe were successes born out of the socialist movement too, and the broader workers' movement. And if you take a longer view and you look at the last 150, 160 years of working class politics, it's actually a track record of pretty great success. We won an 8-hour day. We won basic labor protections. We won progressive income taxes. If you look at the immediate set of demands of the Communist Manifesto, well, a lot of them have actually come about. They come about in ways we wouldn't have expected, in a little bit of a longer time frame. But the history of the workers' movement is not a history of failure. And I think it's worth thinking and acknowledging that we don't live in the worst of all possible worlds. We should be grateful for the victories we won in the past, and we should think about the role of socialists propelling those forward. But yeah, this is often reduced into a very simplistic debate about kind of devoid of all context. And I would accept some of those arguments if there was in fact a left in the US advocating for Soviet-style central planning plus a one-party state and whatever else. If that was the case, then we should be rallying against it, marshaling evidence from history. But what we are seeing now in the US is the emergence of a broadly social democratic left with a further left component, and every part of it is committed to freedom and democracy, and actually want to deepen it against the tyranny of capital.
Yeah, and if I could just add to something there, because this is not just spin, right? Like, you can actually go right now. I encourage everybody, go to the Statista website and look up Russian life expectancy compared to French life expectancy. There are some historical charts there. In 1910, before the Bolshevik Revolution and before World War I, average Russian life expectancy was 33 years old. In France in that same year, it was 49. That's a 16-year gap between Russian and French life expectancy in Europe. By 1970, I believe, the Soviets had increased life expectancy to 68 years and the French to 71, a 3-year gap. That is a huge change in a relatively short 60-year period. And that was despite all of the negatives of the Soviet Union, of which there are many. It's really worth understanding that the Soviet Union, Russia, Tsarist Russia, was an incredibly backward country when it started on this path to socialism. But even despite that, I was just reading a 1957 National Manpower Council report that was called Women Power. And this was a federal report about how to increase the percentage of women in the labor force. And I found a paragraph which explicitly says, look, we are at a disadvantage compared to the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union annually is graduating about 13,000 women engineers, as opposed to 100, less than 100 in the United States in 1957. So for the United States, they were terrified. And remember, 1957 is a really important year because of the launch of Sputnik. They were terrified that they were going to lose the space race because the Soviets had double the brain power when it came to women in engineering, right? They were able to identify women who had the capacity, educate them, and get them into jobs. Whereas the United States, less than 100 women were graduating in 1957 in engineering. So that was a huge catalyst. So despite all of the negatives of these state socialist regimes in Eastern Europe, I think there's something else that's really important, John, which is there's this narrative that socialism, even as it was practiced in this failed way in the 20th century, was totally unsustainable and it would have just collapsed on its own, right? It was a completely unsustainable, unworkable system. They didn't have the right incentives. Central planning was a mess. It was totalitarian. I could give you all sorts of arguments. And yet, at the same time, how many trillions of dollars did the United States government spend to prevent the spread of communism around the world? So if it was a really bad system, why not just let them fail? Right? It seems odd that you can have it both ways, that this is something that was absolutely, irrespective of any rationality, was going to just collapse on its own, versus this is a real threat to our way of life and we have to spend trillions upon trillions of dollars, not to mention all the government interventions and things that we did that were not so nice, to prevent the spread of this ideology. So I think that the very fact that the Cold War took the form that it did shows that, at least, and especially if you go back to 1957 and you're reading US government reports about the threat of communism, a strong and vigorous ideological opponent is what the US government considered communism back then. What we have today is a kind of whitewashing of the real fear in the United States that employers and people in power had of these social movements. And I think that that's precisely why people like Reagan came down so hard on the unions and the labor movement, was to break any sort of real collective opposition to capital. And Bhaskar's absolutely right. There have been real successes, and it was precisely because of those successes that neoliberalism took the form that it did after the advent of the Reagan era.
Excellent. Yeah. Well, we have time for probably one last question. And I think it might be good to look to the future a little bit. Recognizing the successes already that Bhaskar has just outlined, the important changes that socialist principles have already brought all of us in terms of the 8-hour day and things like that. And also trying to avoid the some kind of future utopian socialism ideal in which all of our problems are solved by socialism, and so not full on technicolor luxury communism, but in 10 and 20 or 30 years, what could America look like? What could it realistically look like with a better integration of socialist principles? is there still a role for profit? Do businesses compete?
Mhm.
There's a lot of directions to go with this, but
Yeah.
will people acquire wealth in private property?
Yeah. So, well, to begin with, in the United States, it's relatively easy to imagine what a better society would look like, because we live in a society in which, far from trying to solve very complicated problems of human angst and depression and these existential problems, people are literally freezing to death because of in the United States right now, because of our privatized and totally mismanaged and decentralized power grid, among other reasons. In Texas right now, we have millions of Americans who go hungry every day, millions more without health insurance. So even a lot of the basics that forms of capitalism, under pressure from labor-based parties and other sources, have been able to deliver elsewhere in the world. First of all, we have that to catch up with. So I think beyond that, at the very least, we could imagine an America without these acute forms of suffering, and where on the basis of where you're from or your race or your gender, you're still able to reach your potential. And I think we have to believe that there's a possibility that a democratic state can solve these problems. So on the one hand, I have been really inspired by a lot of the anger and activism of recent years on all sorts of fronts, particularly combating racism. But I think that needs to be coupled with the knowledge that progress has been made in the past, and here's how we made it through organizing and through reforms that often flow through the state, even though the state itself is obviously a flawed actor for all sorts of reasons. But I think when it comes to the actual mechanics of socialism, well, I think society does need to be productive if we are living in conditions of relative scarcity. And I think that means that even though the state should be massively expanded, I think there's a whole host of spheres where we don't need competition. And in fact, competition can be actually counterproductive, ironically, in the mindset of a lot of neoliberals. So for example, the creation of internal markets in the British National Health Service was just utterly counterproductive. The bringing in competition in certain sectors actually just creates useless redundancies. And it ironically also creates extra bureaucracies, because you're keeping track of all these different things that you weren't keeping track of before, and you have different departments at the same agency not communicating with each other. So certain sectors natural monopolies, I guess you could say, and certain other key sectors, I think should be under the control of a democratic and responsive state. But I do believe that markets have an important role to play for a variety of reasons, keeping us innovating and also keeping us productive. And thus there has to be a role for profit in my vision of socialism. And often words like efficiency and productivity might scare a lot of contemporary socialists, but in a just society, being more productive and efficient might mean more time for leisure. Like there's no virtue in the waste of human labor time, and there's no virtue in keeping around a firm that is engaging in labor intensive and really inefficient forms of production, if obviously those people who might be at a firm that is failing, and is allowed to fail, unlike in a lot of state socialist systems, are able to still have the same quality of life, or bounce back and be retrained and go somewhere more productive in a different sector of the economy. So at the very least, I think our immediate task is kind of getting to those limits of social democracy wherever they are, and we have a long way to go in the United States. But beyond that, I do have the full confidence that we can create a more democratic and just society without this permanent class of people who have their power because they own and control. So if by accumulate private property, you mean own a factory or own a department store or whatever else, and no, I don't think that we want that kind of private property because of the power it gives you over other people. But if by private property you mean deciding to spend your money on in a big house in the suburbs, or deciding to buy a small boat or a large boat with money begotten through legitimate means. Like I'm all for that. I probably will not spend my money that way in any world, even if I actually had some. But to me, that money for consumption that's not derived from exploitation or oppression is perfectly legitimate, and people will have different preferences. And also, the last thing I should say is that, it doesn't mean there will be a crude equality in terms of everybody earning the exact same, because people will make different trade-offs and preferences. I will probably be someone who prefers time alone and leisure and time to read than time in production. So I, as a result, might have less money for certain forms of luxury goods. Others will want to work longer because they'll have those preferences, and those will be the trade-offs of the future.
Yeah, well, I think that Bhaskar covered a lot of maybe what I was going to say. And I would just, first of all, I would definitely say that central planning, as it was practiced in most East European countries, did not work very well for consumer goods, right? It worked wonderfully for things more or less, like utility, like what are called natural monopolies. There are certain things that make sense for the government to be functioning. And we have very good data on electricity prices are cheaper when the state owns the utilities rather than when it's privatized. British Rail, they privatized it and they said that it was going to be more efficient and cheaper. And actually it's less efficient and less cheap. And the infrastructure is, eroding because there's no incentive to invest in that if you're a private company, because eventually you could just shove it off on the state and taxpayers will pay for it. So I think we have very good data to show that there are certain things that are natural monopolies in society, and that the state should control and own and operate on behalf of the citizens. Democratically elected states should do this for the sake of the people who are going to benefit from that. But for like my shampoo or my clothes or the kind of toothpaste I use or whatever, like those things, the state, I've actually seen these documents of central planners trying to figure out like how many women's bras to make and in what sizes. And the state has no business trying to make a decision for all women at all times, right? That's just ridiculous. And so you've got to understand that there's no possible world in which a state is ever going to make those decisions correctly for the kinds of things that are ephemeral and that make, one of the things that make life enjoyable. One of the things that people in Eastern Europe desperately wanted when the wall fell were these consumer goods. But aside from those technical questions about planning versus markets, the one thing that I want to do is come back to this question of individualism. I think we live in a society in the United States where we have this myth of the individual, the kind of pull yourself up by the bootstraps, feeling that you have to be constantly investing in your personal brand in order to succeed in our society. We become nodes in a machine whereby we are all just hustling to make ends meet. And it's this zero-sum idea of individualism, which I think can be quite toxic in society. And I want to plug Wendy Brown's book, Undoing the Demos, as well as there was a book written by a guy called Malcolm Harris about kids these days. It was about millennials. And I think both of those books really speak to this idea that we have allowed ourselves as individualists to be commodified, and that capitalism has sort of found a way to strategically use our individualism against us. And if we go back to Mill and we think about socialism as the opposite of individualism, we need to think that in 20 or 30 years, maybe, John, like we will live in a society where we do not reify individualism to the extent that we do today, that we actually see social value in collectivity and cooperation and friendships and relationships. Alexandra Kollontai, the Russian theorist, called this like comradely love. Like we would be embedded in bigger, wider, healthier social networks that make life more interesting and more pleasant and more rich in, on a day-to-day basis, rather than just, like scrappy, kind of scrounging for money so we can buy a bigger boat because somehow the bigger boat will make us feel like we're successful individuals. I actually think that individualism is making a lot of people really unhappy, and the pandemic has shown that. And so, outside of the larger political and policy questions, which are very important, and I don't want to belittle them, I think there's also, for people who are listening out there, thinking about yourself and thinking about yourself as an individual versus thinking of yourself as part of a community, whatever that community is. As we move into the future and we realize that there are certain things that the market cannot solve, climate change, extreme inequality, the pandemic, for instance, right? Automation. Markets are terrible at these things. The only force in society that is going to be able to deal with the challenges that we face in the 21st century are collective action. And the fundamental basis of collective action has to be a move away from the reification of individualism as some sort of ideal in our society to really valuing people who are connected and social with others as part of a community, and who really feel that that is the most valuable thing in their lives are those relationships, rather than what they can ultimately get out of those relationships, which I fear is where we are right now.
Excellent. I look forward to that day.
I think we all do.
Well, thank you, Kristen and Bhaskar, for taking the time to talk with us. This has been, I think, enlightening and really an excellent conversation. Folks out there, you can find a link to purchase their books from a local bookstore below on this page. And if you don't already, follow the New York State Writers Institute to stay in the conversation. I'm John Warren, and thanks for watching.